He wasn't supposed to be home that day. And she wasn't supposed to be holding his children like that. Sebastian Locke, reclusive billionaire, grieving widower and master of control, had spent months locked in boardrooms, pushing grief aside with stock charts and strategy. But something pulled him back that morning. A whisper, a silence too loud to ignore. He walked through the gates of his countryside estate expecting stillness order. Instead, he heard laughter, raw, unfiltered laughter. And when he stepped into the garden, he saw Grace Delacroix, the black maid he barely remembered hiring, kneeling barefoot on the grass, cradling one of his twin sons in her arms, while the other splashed happily beside her in a makeshift bath under the open sky. They were soaked, muddy, and for the first time since his wife's death, alive. Sebastian froze, not out of anger, not at first, but because, for one terrifying, inexplicable moment, he didn't recognize his own life anymore. And what happened next would change everything. The gravel crunched beneath Sebastian Locke's Italian loafers as he stepped out of the black Range Rover. The air in Hampshire was cooler than London's cleaner, too. It was supposed to be a routine drop-in review. The estate's accounts checked the renovations on the West Wing nod at the help. 30 minutes, and he'd be gone. Instead, he stood frozen on the edge of the garden, watching the scene unfold like something out of someone else's life. The twins Theo and Max were laughing, not just smiling, not faking it for a camera, but actually laughing, splashing barefoot in a wide copper basin, soaked through faces glowing. And at the center of it all was her. Grace Delacroix, late 20s, quiet, efficient. The housekeeper he hired through the agency 6 weeks ago. A name he signed off on while skimming a list. One of many. She didn't notice him right away. She was too focused on making a small crown out of rosemary twigs for Theo's head. Her sleeves were rolled-up curls tied back in a scarf, eyes soft but alert in a way that caught him off guard. He hadn't seen his sons that happy since. No, since never. His throat tightened. Grace finally looked up and saw him. In a single breath, the joy drained from her face. She stood up quickly, wiping her hands on her apron cheeks, flushing. The boys followed her gaze. Daddy Max shouted, climbing out of the basin and running toward him, slipping on wet grass, but unfazed. Sebastian knelt without thinking and caught his son in his arms. The small body pressed against him, warm and wet and giggling. Theo followed slower, but beaming. "Daddy, we made soup for the bees." Sebastian blinked. "You what?" Grace stepped forward, clearly embarrassed. "It's just water and petals, sir. They called it soup." I didn't, but he raised a hand not to stop her, but to steady himself. "It's fine." It wasn't fine. Not in the traditional sense. Not in the way he measured fine by order, by stillness, by control. It was something else. "Would you like me to take them in for lunch?" Sir Grace asked quietly, already reaching for towels. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around. The grass was trampled, the copper basin dented, a line of muddy footprints led all the way to the rose trellis. The scene was chaos, and yet his sons were smiling. Grace was calm, and he, for the first time in months, didn't feel like running. "Lunch," he finally said, voice soft. "Yes, that's a good idea." He watched her gather the boys, wrapping them gently in towels like a mother would. Her movements were precise, instinctive. And that was when the first question truly settled in his chest. Who was Grace Delacroix, really? And how had she managed to reach the two people he loved most without him ever noticing? The estate's grand dining hall was made for silence, long wooden tables, ancient tapestries, and windows that filtered light like a cathedral. But today it buzzed, not with noise exactly, but with something else. A shift. Sebastian sat at the far end, nursing a cup of black coffee that had gone cold. His sons, wrapped in fresh clothes and glowing from their play, sat beside Grace at the smaller table near the bay window, laughing over something with crumbs on their lips and jam on their cheeks. He wasn't used to being ignored in his own house, especially not by two boys who just weeks ago wouldn't go to bed, without his voice reading them the same bedtime story their mother used to read. But now, they barely glanced at him. They had Grace, He studied her. She moved with quiet confidence, cutting fruit-wiping mouths, whispering answers to whispered questions. No theatrics, no performance, just presence. It was disarming. "Did you work with children before this?" he asked abruptly, voice carrying across the room. Grace looked up, startled. "Yes, sir." He gestured for her to come closer. She hesitated, then stood wiping her hands on her apron before approaching. "Where?" he asked. "I trained as a nurse. Pediatric care." She folded her hands neatly. "But I never completed the certification. My mother got sick, and I had to care for her full time. After she passed, I shifted paths and ended up here." She didn't flinch. "Yes." Sebastian nodded slowly, fingers tapping the porcelain cup. "Do you always take liberties with your employer's children?" There was a flicker in her expression, not fear, something else, steel beneath Grace. "With respect, sir," she said calmly, "they weren't being children. Not when I arrived. They were walking shadows." That hit deeper than he expected. She added softer now, "Oh, they need to laugh again." He looked toward the boys. Theo was showing Max how to make a butterfly with toast crusts. They were so utterly unmistakably alive. And he hated that it felt like Grace had done in 6 weeks what grief counselors, private tutors, and elite nannies couldn't do in 6 months. "Why the copper basin?" he asked, glancing back at her. "There are 3 bathtubs in this house." Her lips twitched with a hint of a smile. "They refused, said the big tubs were too quiet. The basin was my compromise." He didn't know what unnerved him more, the fact that she had answered honestly, or the fact that it made perfect sense. He dismissed her with a nod, but her words stayed. "They weren't being children," it echoed. Later that evening, long after the twins had fallen asleep, one clutching a toy rabbit, the other curled up with a book, Sebastian walked down to the old staff quarters. Grace's light was still on. He hesitated outside her door, then turned away. He didn't knock. Not yet. Because something about her presence was beginning to chip away at the stone walls he'd so carefully built. And the part of him that still bled wasn't ready to let her in. Not yet. The next morning, Sebastian found himself awake earlier than usual. Not because of meetings or alarms, but because of laughter. Not the loud kind. The kind that slipped under doors and through stone walls. The kind that reminded you what a home was supposed to sound like. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, half-dressed in a crisp shirt and undone cuffs, listening. It was coming from the conservatory. He followed it. Inside, golden morning lights spilled across the tiled floor. Grace sat cross-legged on a blanket with the boys surrounded by pages of hand-drawn maps, toy animals, and a globe that had been collecting dust since before his wife passed. "We're planning an expedition," Max explained, pointing to a childishly drawn compass. "To Antarctica," Theo added, very serious. "But first, we have to stop in Morocco, because the penguins get cold." Grace nodded solemnly. "That's what the soup is for." Sebastian leaned against the doorway, watching. This wasn't part of any lesson plan. No screen time limits or reward charts. No curated curriculum. Just imagination, spilling everywhere, flourishing. He almost didn't want to interrupt, but something pulled him closer. "Morocco before Antarctica?" he asked. Bold strategy. The boys squealed and ran to him, clinging to his legs like vines. "Daddy, Daddy, you can be the captain." Grace stood slowly, brushing off her skirt. "Sorry, sir. They insisted on geography before breakfast." He gave a slight nod. They never used to insist on anything. She smiled faintly. Now they do. There was a silence then, not awkward, but weighty. He studied her again. The calm, the ease, the strange familiarity. And then, almost without meaning to, he asked, "Did you know?" Charlotte Grace blinked. "Your wife?" He nodded. "No, sir," she said. "Only through what the boys have told me." And yet, something about her didn't add up. The way she moved through the house, the way the twins trusted her so deeply. She had the instincts of someone who knew more than she let on. He stepped closer. "Forgive me," he said. "I don't remember seeing your name on any of the applicant lists." "You wouldn't," she replied gently. "I didn't apply through the agency." He raised an eyebrow. "Then how did you get hired?" She hesitated. For the first time visibly, "I was recommended by someone who used to work here. I believe her name was Marianne, head of the kitchen staff. She reached out before she passed away." Sebastian froze. Marianne had been with the estate for nearly 20 years. Charlotte trusted her, and Marianne had died just months after Charlotte. Before Sebastian could bring himself to return home. "She said the boys needed warmth," Grace added, voice quiet, not just care. Sebastian stepped back slowly, his mind spinning. And for the first time, he wondered if Grace hadn't just come into his house, but into a life she already knew more about than she was admitting. The rest of the day unfolded with an odd undercurrent. The twins played the staff, carried on their quiet routines, and the sun lingered longer than usual over the Hampshire hills. But Sebastian Locke found himself unsettled. He was a man of reason, of structure, of balance sheets and strategy meetings. But Grace Delacroix didn't fit any column in his ledger. After dinner, when the boys were tucked into bed and the halls had grown still, he walked into the old study, Charlotte's favorite room. It hadn't been touched since her passing. Dust cloaked the shelves, and sunlight no longer reached the corners. He stood in the doorway for a long while before crossing to the desk. Her journals were still stacked there. Her handwriting looped quick elegance, spilled across the pages in bursts of ink and thought. He hadn't read them before. Until tonight. Page after page, reflections on motherhood, grief, guilt, hope. And then, a name. Grace. He paused. "The girl from the ward? She was there again today." Quiet as always. "But she has the softest hands." Theo stopped crying when she touched his cheek. "I don't know why that made me cry too." Sebastian turned the page. She said nothing, but she saw everything. The way Max flinched when I raised my voice. The way I flinched when I caught myself doing it. He kept reading. "If something happens to me, I hope someone like her finds them. Someone who doesn't just see their pain, but knows how to hold it." His throat tightened. Charlotte had known her, not formally, not through staff meetings or resumes, but through chance, through moments. He shut the journal gently, as if closing a door between two worlds. Then he moved, down the hallway, past the kitchen, toward the quiet back corridor where Grace stayed. He didn't knock. This time he needed answers. She opened the door, already dressed down in a cardigan and soft slippers. She didn't look surprised to see him. "I read Charlotte's journal," he said. Grace didn't blink. "I thought you might. You knew her." She nodded once, briefly, at the children's hospital. "I was a volunteer on weekends." She never asked my name. I never gave it. But I was there. "You sought out this job because of her," No, Grace said softly. "Because of them." She stepped aside. He entered. Her room was small but clean. A vase of dried lavender, a well-worn paperback by the lamp, a photograph tucked into the mirror, a boy in a hospital gown, holding a chess piece, grinning wide. "My brother," she said, noticing his glance. "He died when I was 15, cancer." He looked at her. "You've carried too much. So have you." They stood there, two people holding grief, like porcelain between them. Finally, she said Charlotte smiled only twice that day. Once when Max stopped crying. Once when Theo kissed her hand. But she never looked at me like I was invisible. Her voice trembled just slightly. "And I've been invisible most of my life." Sebastian's hands clenched at his sides. He didn't know what he was supposed to say, what he was allowed to feel. But one thing was becoming painfully clear. Grace Delacroix had not entered his world by accident, and now she was part of it in ways he couldn't untangle, even if he wanted to. 2 days later, the estate received its first visitor in months. Lady Eleanor Locke. Sebastian's older sister and unofficial gatekeeper of the family legacy, arrived unannounced in a vintage cream Bentley, her heels echoing on the stone driveway like a drumbeat of judgment. She walked into the drawing room with the grace of a woman who expected obedience. Sebastian barely looked up from the papers on his lap. "I didn't know you were back in England?" "I wasn't," she replied coolly, removing her gloves. "But whispers travel quickly, and apparently you've replaced nannies with—" Her brow arched. "A maid." Sebastian's jaw tightened. "She's more than that." "I'm sure she is." Eleanor sat legs crossed with surgical precision. "Sebastian, this is not about gossip. It's about appearances. Your wife has been gone less than a year, and now you're playing house with a domestic worker who has," she gestured vaguely, "inserted herself into your family's most vulnerable space." "She hasn't inserted herself," he said sharply. "She was needed." Eleanor leaned forward. Needed or convenient? Before Sebastian could respond, the sound of laughter floated in from the hallway. Grace and the twins playing chess again. One of them shouted checkmate with triumph. The other groaned in theatrical defeat. Eleanor's gaze darkened. "She's in too deep," she said quietly. "The boys are bonding with her." "Yes," Sebastian replied. "They are. You realize what that means, don't you? If this woman walks out, or worse is removed, those boys will feel abandoned all over again. This is dangerous, Sebastian." He stood. "What's dangerous is pretending they're healing when they're not. What's dangerous is measuring loyalty in bloodlines and job titles instead of actions." Eleanor rose too, voice low. "You sound emotional." "I am," he said. "For once." Later that evening, Grace found Sebastian alone in the library. She approached with hesitation. "Your sister's leaving in the morning." He nodded. She spoke to the twins, told them not to get too attached. Her voice trembled. They didn't understand. Sebastian turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "She's afraid," he said. "Of what change?" he replied. "And of people she can't control." Grace looked down. "Should I go?" It wasn't a test. It was a genuine question. She had lived her life on borrowed time in other people's homes. She knew when the door was about to close. But Sebastian didn't hesitate. "No," he said. "You stay." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I've watched those boys sleep soundly for the first time in months. I've seen color return to their drawings. I've seen hope creep back into the quiet corners of this house. That didn't come from therapy, or money, or my sister's social rules." He looked her straight in the eyes. "That came from you." By the next morning, the air in the estate had shifted. Grace could feel it, even before anyone said a word. The quiet glances, the sudden presence of household staff she'd never seen before, the calls from unknown numbers that Sebastian didn't return. She'd lived enough lives to recognize when a storm was being orchestrated elegantly, discreetly, and mercilessly. Downstairs, Eleanor stood in the conservatory with the family solicitor. "Yes, I've reviewed the contract," she said, voice clipped. "No formal employment file, no vetted references, no liability waivers." She sipped her tea. "One unfortunate accident, and this entire estate is vulnerable." The solicitor hesitated. "But Mr. Locke seems emotionally invested." "Then it's time he's reminded what's at stake." Upstairs, Grace packed her overnight bag quietly, not out of surrender but preparation. She didn't want the boys to see her forced out. She'd seen what abandonment did to a child. But before she could zip it closed, Sebastian stepped into the room. "What are you doing?" he asked. "I thought it best to make this easy," she replied gently. "Eleanor's not wrong about protocol." Sebastian stared at the bag, then at her. This isn't about protocol, he said. It's about control. Grace didn't argue. She just sat on the edge of the bed, twisting the bracelet on her wrist. I didn't come here to disrupt anything, she whispered. I only meant to stay long enough to help. But somewhere along the way, it started to feel like home. Sebastian walked to the window. Outside, the twins were building a makeshift fort out of blankets and books. One of them waved up at the window. He waved back automatically, then turned. What happens when you leave? Grace looked up, startled. What happens when they cry for you in the middle of the night? When they whisper your name during thunderstorms? When they draw your face instead of their mother's? He stepped closer. This isn't about employment anymore, Grace. Not for me. Not for them. A silence passed. And then he asked very simply, would you stay? If I asked you to, officially, not as help, as family. Grace's breath caught. He wasn't proposing romance. He was offering belonging. And in a life like hers, that was far rarer. Before she could answer, the door burst open. Eleanor stood in the doorway, holding a file. I thought you should see this, she said sharply, addressing Sebastian. It's about her. Grace stood slowly. Eleanor. But the older woman slammed the folder on the dresser. She has a sealed juvenile record. Do you know what that means? Fraud. Trespassing. She's not who she says she is. Sebastian opened the file, eyes scanning the pages. Grace's face went pale. I was 16, she said quietly. I forged a signature to get my brother admitted to a hospital he couldn't afford. He had leukemia. We were alone. I had no choice. Eleanor crossed her arms. She's a criminal. No, Sebastian said softly, closing the folder. She's a survivor. And then he did something no one in that house expected. He walked over to Grace, took her hand, and looked Eleanor straight in the eye. She stays. By the end of the week, the news had broken. It started with a discreet column in a tabloid, Billionaire's Maid Has Criminal Past. A blurry photo of Grace walking through the village, a zoomed-in shot of the estate gates behind her. Then came the gossip blogs, the anonymous social media threads, the speculation. Who is Grace Delacroix, from juvenile offender to governess Locke family in turmoil? Grace avoided the internet, but she couldn't avoid the stares. At the grocer's, the whispers followed her like shadows. At church, old women clutched their handbags tighter when she passed. And back at the estate, the staff grew tense. Some had worked for the Locke family for generations. They valued order, reputation, appearances. Now their employer was defending a woman the world had labeled a fraud. Inside the drawing room, Sebastian stood with his PR advisor, arms crossed. You need to make a statement, the advisor said. Distance yourself. I won't. She's not your wife. She's the only reason this house feels like a home again. The advisor hesitated. This isn't just about optics, Sebastian. You're planning a global expansion. Locke Industries is hosting diplomats next quarter. Do you really want your name tied to controversy? Sebastian looked out the window. The twins were in the garden playing with Grace. She was teaching them how to fold origami boats, her hands moving gently, their laughter rising like music. He turned back. Then we changed the conversation. That evening, he stood before a row of microphones outside the estate gates, press swarming. Yes, he began. Grace Delacroix had a troubled past. When she was a teenager, she committed an act of fraud to save her brother's life. He was terminally ill. She had no parents, no support, only courage. Camera shutters clicked. She broke the law, he continued. But she did so with more integrity and selflessness than many of the so-called leaders you praise. He paused. And if you think that disqualifies her from being a caregiver, a teacher, a protector to my sons, then perhaps you've forgotten what real character looks like. The speech was broadcast live across multiple channels. Some praised his candor, Others were outraged. Old business partners sent cautious messages. Some board members requested private meetings. But one message rose above the rest. A letter handwritten in careful script sent to Grace. In a pale blue envelope, "Dear Miss Delacroix, I watched you speak to those boys once. You listened like no one ever had. I was the nurse on duty the day your brother passed. I remember you held his hand until the end. You were never a criminal. You were always brave." With admiration, Margaret Ainsley, retired saint. Luke's hospice Grace held the letter in trembling hands. For the first time since the storm began, she cried. Not out of fear, but out of the rarest thing she'd ever been given, grace. The estate grew quieter in the weeks that followed, not in silence, but in stillness. The press had found a new scandal to chase. The angry headlines gave way to quieter murmurs, and then to indifference. What once felt like an explosion now settled into soft ash. Inside the manor, life resumed. But something had changed. Sebastian noticed it first in the way Grace moved through the house, not with hesitation, but with intention. She no longer avoided his gaze. She no longer waited for permission. One afternoon he found her in the West Library with the twins. The boys were building a domino chain between the furniture, laughing as they knocked over rows of carefully placed pieces. Grace was watching barefoot, the sunlight catching in her hair. Sebastian leaned on the doorway and just watched. "You've turned them into philosophers," he teased. "They turned me into someone soft," she replied. He smiled. "Good." They stood in the quiet, the sound of tumbling dominoes echoing softly. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "I've never stayed anywhere this long." He looked at her. "Do you want to?" She turned toward him, eyes steady. "I think I do." But even in that softness, there was something she wasn't saying. He could see it in her hands, fidgeting with her bracelet, the way her gaze flicked away when he stepped too close. He knew that look. It was the look of someone who had only ever been temporary, someone who had taught themselves not to expect permanence, not even kindness that lasted. So he didn't push. But that night, after the boys were asleep, Sebastian found her sitting under the willow tree just beyond the garden wall, the same place she had gone the day the press turned on her, the same place she went when she needed to breathe. He walked over and sat beside her. No words. Just the wind rustling the branches above the smell of wet earth and lavender. Then softly, without looking at her, he said, "I used to think grief had made me cold, that I'd never feel anything again. But watching you, watching how you held them, how you protected them, how you stood tall even when the world tried to shrink you." He paused. "You reminded me that warmth isn't weakness." Grace's voice was barely a whisper. "And you reminded me that trust doesn't always end in betrayal." They sat in silence again, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of things unspoken, of a connection, quietly building, not from grand gestures, but from presence, from endurance, from care. And just before they went back inside, Sebastian asked her the only question that mattered now. "Will you stay for good?" This time she didn't hesitate. "I already have." Autumn swept over the Southampton estate in a flurry of amber leaves and brisk winds. Inside the manor, the twins were preparing for their first school recital. Grace stitching costumes by the fire, while Sebastian attempted to glue feathers onto a homemade crown, laughing more than succeeding. For the first time in years, the house felt alive. Then the envelope arrived, thick, cream-colored, hand-delivered by a private solicitor. Sebastian opened it at the kitchen table, Grace nearby pouring tea. As his eyes scanned the pages, the warmth slowly drained from his face. "What is it?" she asked softly. He swallowed. "My late wife's estate. Apparently, there's a codicil." Grace paused, cup in hand. What kind of codicil? Sebastian didn't answer right away. He finished reading, then set the letter down. She created a trust, one I didn't know about. In it, she appointed guardianship of the twins to her sister. If I was ever deemed emotionally unfit to raise them. Grace stiffened. But she passed years ago. Why now, she added an automatic review clause, triggered if a non-relative caregiver resided with the boys longer than 6 months. Grace sat down slowly, heart pounding. You mean me? Sebastian met her gaze. I'll fix it. This was written during a time when she didn't trust anyone. She was sick, afraid, but her sister... He exhaled. Her sister is a problem. A prominent art dealer in Edinburgh. Cold, calculated, and already aware of the clause. She arrived at the estate days later with sharp heels and sharper intentions. I heard you're playing house with the help Sebastian, she said within minutes of walking through the front door. Grace, ever composed, extended her hand. Grace Delacroix. Lorraine didn't take it. Instead, she glanced around. And where are my nephews? I'd like to see how they're doing. Clearly someone has to. Sebastian's jaw clenched, but Grace touched his wrist gently. It's okay, she whispered. Lorraine spent the weekend in the manor like a hawk circling a wounded animal. She watched, asked questions, took notes, and by Sunday evening her intentions were clear. I'll be filing for temporary custody, she announced over dinner, until the court can determine what's in the best interest of the children. Sebastian slammed his fork down. You haven't seen them in 3 years. And now I'm correcting that mistake, she said coolly. A scandalized maid playing surrogate mother to 2 heirs. The tabloids alone would sway any judge. Grace stood, not in anger, in resolve. I'll speak to the court myself, she said. They'll hear what the boys want. Lorraine laughed. They're children. They don't get to decide. Grace tilted her head slightly like she was reading a complex blueprint, then smiled. You really don't know them at all, do you? The shopkeepers, the school teachers, the vicar, even the local constable. When the case reached the family court, it wasn't just Sebastian and Grace who showed up. It was a village, and at the heart of it were 2 little boys standing in their neat school uniforms, each holding one of Grace's hands. When the judge asked who they wished to live with, their answer echoed without hesitation. With her. The courtroom held its breath. 2 small boys stood side by side, fingers clenched tightly around Grace's. The older one, Elliot, cleared his throat, then stepped forward. I don't want to leave my home, he said clearly. This is our home. Grace takes care of us. She makes sure we do our homework. She reads to us at night. She knows which stories make my brother cry, and she stops before the sad parts. The younger boy nodded, his voice barely a whisper. She smells like cinnamon, like Mom used to. A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Lorraine shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her lawyer glanced at her eyebrows raised, and he hadn't expected this. The judge looked down at the boys, then up at Grace. Miss Delacroix, would you like to say anything? Grace's voice was steady but soft. I came into their lives through a side door, she began. I never expected to be a mother. I never assumed I was owed their love or trust. But they gave it to me anyway, and I've done my best every day since to deserve it. She paused, emotion rising in her throat. I've made mistakes in my past, but this is the one thing I know I've done right. The judge sat back. His fingers steepled under his chin. Children know who loves them, and who shows up for them when no one else does. He looked at Lorraine. Miss Kingsley, your petition is denied. Then he turned to Sebastian. Full custody remains with the father, and I strongly recommend formalizing Miss Delacroix's role in their lives. Grace exhaled shakily. Sebastian reached for her hand. The boys whooped loud enough for the bailiff to chuckle. Lorraine stood stiffly, brushing imaginary dust from her blazer. This is a mistake, she hissed before leaving the courtroom without another glance. But no one followed her. Weeks passed. The estate returned to its quiet rhythm, only now everything had changed. Grace no longer stayed in the East Wing. She moved into the family wing. Her name was added to the school records. Her photograph now stood among the family portraits in the hall. One golden morning, as the twins ran outside chasing their dog, Sebastian found Grace on the balcony, watching the sunlight pour over the grounds. "I've been thinking," he said, "about legacy." She turned. "Wealth fades," he said. "Buildings crumble. But if the boys grow up to be kind, decent men, that will be our legacy." She smiled. "Ours." He stepped closer, then offered a small velvet box. She didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, she looked into his eyes and said, "This time it's forever." Sebastian nodded. "This time it's only just begun." And somewhere in the corner of the estate, the wind carried the laughter of two children, two hearts healed, and the quiet promise that family isn't always made by blood, but by love.